amazing faces on this call. And you guys need to know that you guys are in amazing hands. Your board and your staff is a 10 out of 10. I work beside these guys every day and they care so much about the sport. So I just listened to the end of that AGM. It just reminded me of how lucky we all are to have Lindsay and the board and Chris and Lauren at Squash Ontario. So that's that's my suck up piece. Okay. So I actually have two pieces to my presentation. I'm really excited to see Doug. Doug is going to give you a ton of background, I think, on what's going on the Olympic front. So my presentation is actually two pieces. I'm going to do the first one first and then let Doug do his thing because he's got a bit of background. And then I will follow with some real-time Olympic updates that we just got last week from the World Squash Federation. But I think it's important to let Doug sort of set up how we got here first. So what I want to talk about first is just where Squash Canada is at with this whole Olympic business. And so background is we're in actually a holding pattern right now, which has been a little bit frustrating, totally understandable until Paris 2024 has been wrapped up. They're not really starting this quadrennial. So we are all chomping at the bit to find out what's going to happen and how it's all going to play out. But they literally just got back from Paris like last week. And so that's sort of the delineation mark of when our quadrennial begins. So information is going to be forthcoming in the next 2 to 3 months. This is a really big period for us, but it has been a little bit sort of anxious. We know we're in the Olympics. We know we're going to have a lot of opportunities to leverage that, but we don't really know the details, but they are coming out. So a couple things to note. So we're now aligned with the Canadian Olympic Committee, which is these are the rings. I just wore this top. So this is us now. So we're at the big girl table. So we have direct access to that whole organization, which is really robust, really impressive. I don't know if you're watching Paris 2024, but obviously we did amazing again, Canada. So we're on that team now, which is really exciting. The second organization that we're working with is Own the Podium, which is actually a third-party fundraising organization. And they have an envelope of funds that they direct to owning the podium. And that's literal. One of the big mandates for both of these organizations with Olympics is medal potential. So you do see a lot of press about us on podiums and, winning medals. But what you don't see is that if you're not in the mix, you're not getting funded. And that's a big reality of the situation is that they really only are looking for medal potential and they're not really funding the organizations that aren't set up to deliver that mandate. So big responsibility. The Canadian Olympic Committee, we have a program called Enhanced Excellence and Next Gen Excellence that we're going to be applying for. And so in the coming months, we'll find out what sort of funds we get to run our programming for the next 4 years. So this is what we're presenting to them. We have a presentation and we're trying to show them that we're really well set up for not so much 2028 medal potential. We know the reality of that, but 2032, if and when we get to Brisbane, that we are going to be, one of the top squash countries in the world, and we need to be funded accordingly. So this is the presentation that I've been sharing, and I thought it would be useful. I'll go through it quickly. Lindsay has it now; she can share it after. But any feedback you might have, I'm open to as well. But really, we want to show that from 2020 to 2024, we are pretty well set up. I mean, COVID was absolutely devastating, but we have these great building blocks in place, and Canada is still a world leader in squash. Our junior girls came third in the World Championships this past summer. Our women national team came sixth in the world. So this isn't a full rebuild. We got some great building blocks in place. The glass court program has been great. You've all seen it, I hope, but it's been really productive, set of events, moving the court around the country. We're getting a lot of good traction there. Our athletes are getting the experience, but also we're able to trickle down into the grassroots and just get a lot more exposure. So that's a real positive. We've revamped our athlete development infrastructure. So we've got a series of squads now. A big part of that is traditionally our top players go down to university. They play in the Ivy Leagues. We say goodbye. They get jobs on Wall Street and we don't hear from them again. We're now really focused on keeping them in our pipeline. And so we have a next gen squad and we have a junior squad that captures sort of our top 20 to 30 best college players. We have having meetings with them and their primary coaches all for this whole month coming up. So that's really important to us, is keeping those players in the pipeline If you're watching Ali Farag and Victor Cruin, Gina Kennedy, they're now going through that college system and they're coming out and they're becoming the best players in the world. That wasn't a reality 20 years ago. So we're focusing deeply on that. Consistent top 10 finishes at the World Champs. I just outlined where we're at there. The men need a bit of work, but our junior boys came 10th too. So it's not, we're not that far off. So what we're really focusing on for the next 4 years is these 4 pillars: national training centers, individualized athlete funding, national event circuit, and CAN squash program, which is a grassroots curriculum that we're going to be rolling out, which will be available to the first, any player at any club across the country will have the same consistent programming, very similar to CAN skate, or some of the swimming programs you see. Tennis has rolled this out. So we're excited about that. 2028 onward, this is where we're going to make our real mark. 2032, hopefully when we get there, we want to be on the podium. So Lindsay, I should have had you do this.
Yeah, here we scroll. Go.
Okay. Yeah, not bad. Okay. Just a bit slow. Scrolling, but it's not working.
Can't help you there. If you go to the right side, just take that bar and scroll it down.
Oh yeah, here we go. Okay, beauty. So I outlined our building blocks. Just a bit more details on the glass court stuff. Certainly the creation of our squads, standardized physical and technical. And then we do want to keep our foot on the gas, top 10 finishes in between now and then. These are the 4 pillars I talked about. I'll go through them very quickly. We have a concept of 4 major national training center hubs: Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and Calgary. This is the confluence of where our top players across the country are. And the idea is to have a daily and or weekly training environment. We've been working really closely with Squash Ontario and starting to do this throughout the summer. That's really a good pinch point for us, where we get the university players, the juniors, and the pros all together. Having the best coaches and best players together as much as possible is not rocket science. It's tried and true, and that's where we're really going to focus. But having some real infrastructure in those 4 areas is critical, and that's what the Canadian Olympic Committee wants to see as well. Individualized athlete funding. So this is a thing. If you come out of U.S. college squash right now, U.S. squash pays you a working salary to be a professional squash player. As you're building your ranking up, and as you're sort of building your career to that place where it's self-sustaining. Golf Canada does this. Tennis Canada does this. Squash Canada will do this. We need to pay these college athletes or young athletes that are turning pro a working wage, so they don't have to make that decision. Do I have to work part-time? Do I have to coach part-time? We need them to focus on achieving their goals. So this is a big part of the program. Every other model does this. I think we have to get over the hump here culturally, that this is their profession. This isn't sort of a romantic journey where you're sleeping on couches and you're sort of, working your way, cutting your teeth on the lower level events. This is a job. So this is a big part of it. We need to raise money to actually pay these athletes so they can do what they need to do. Event circuit. We already have an amazing event circuit here in Canada. I know there's some really cool stuff happening in Southwestern Ontario. I'm heading down tomorrow with the Nash Cup and the related events in Chatham and Sarnia. So we have a really good event system. It's critical for our athletes to be able to play these events on their home soil and not have to travel, and then have the opportunity for our younger players. I don't know how many young Canadians are playing in this event this weekend, but this is critical for us. So we're going to keep supporting that and keep building it and making it a bit more formal. Can squash. So this is what I talked about off the hopper. This program is in development. We have a pretty good working group, and we've made some progress. We're going to be using a platform called Play Builder. And essentially any club, any member club in Canada will have access to this program, where their coaches will have a curriculum, 8-week program for juniors age 6 to 9. Here's what you do on day 1 or week 1, week 2, week 3. The program's all laid out for you. It'll have standardized language. It'll have graphics. It'll have video. And the idea is to really raise the floor of our coaching. So a volunteer that's doing great work, we know these are like the lifeblood of our junior programs, are now able to have a curriculum. They're not sort of winging it, and they're able to follow along and sort of raise the floor and give each new player like the maximum experience as they enter the sport. And so the goal is to increase the number of junior squash players by 50% by 2028. And that'll put us in really good position. Financial needs, this is sort of my problem, not yours, but this is what we're approaching the COC with. Is it's $500,000 a year to fund this. It might seem like a lot to us, but most sports are doing 10 times this in terms of their high performance programming. So this is what we're targeting as our needs over the next 4 years, $2 million total. Funding vehicles, again, this is sort of my things that we're going to be rolling out in the next little bit. But I do want to note we have a really cool program coming out where clubs can host national squad members as a fundraiser. So we did a trial at the BNR this year. It was really great. We had David Ballageron and Holly Naughton come. They did a clinic. They did an exhibition. They did a Q&A. And there was a tax receipt available for all the donors, and we were able to put 80% of those funds right back into their pockets. And that's a program that you're going to see across Ontario for sure. And we'd love you to support it. It's a great way to get access to the athletes. It's like they're so accessible. They're jumping on with your juniors, they're jumping on with your adults, and we can use the tax receipt to get them funded. So that's one thing I wanted to note. So I think that brings me to the end, Lindsay, of where we're at. I will note the Canadian Women's Open is October 27th and to 31st at Brookfield Place in Toronto. Hopefully you've heard about it. You're going to see a lot more coming down the pipeline next week. But this will be our official Olympic launch with the Canadian Olympic Committee. So they'll have presence there. The logo, not the rings, but this logo will be on the glass court, and we are announcing to the Canadian world that we are now in the Olympics. So that's next month. So pretty exciting.
Amazing.
I'll stop there and turn it over to Doug.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Just as a follow-on to that, you and the Squash Canada team are doing amazing stuff, as we can see from this presentation. But your success is also our success, and club success and player success. So we're excited to get involved, and this is why I wanted to bring you on here. Is 55% of the senior and next gen squads are from Ontario, so this is all of our problem. It's not just yours. Let's bring this together so that we can succeed. So thank you, Jamie.
Cheers. I'm going to stay on and answer questions with Doug at the end.
Awesome. So next up, Doug Whittaker is joining us. So some of you may know Doug from his past life at the Toronto Cricket Club, growing up in Toronto. He is a national champion in Canada many times over. He is currently coaching in the US and sort of volunteered his time to go over to the British Open earlier this year and attend the squash summit that happened. So the squash summit, I think we'll hear a ton of cool takeaways from the WSF, the PSA, US Squash, is sort of all over the map there about the theme of us getting into the Olympics for the first time, what that means right now, and what that our collective role to stay in the Olympics. So I'll hand it over to Doug, and thank you, Doug, for joining us.
Okay, can you hear me? You good?
Yes.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, for letting me join the group. And it was interesting talking to Jamie because his timing's really good, because I did a talk before, and now I'm doing this one. And in the interim, the Olympics have happened. So looks like everyone's been very busy now that this is going on. So the timing's perfect to talk about what was discussed at the Squash Summit in June. And it's really good for squash, and hopefully I can add to what's been going on, because I'm going to report on what was talked about there. And I think it's going to be pretty interesting. I'm going to do it in 3 sections. One is going to be what was discussed about the Olympics. The second part was the WSF, the PSA, and the US Squash had a panel. So that's an interesting thing to report on. And the third thing is growth of squash globally, what they're doing across the world to grow the sport. So as Lindsay said, the summit was in England in early June. There were 65 people from all over the world. And there was a ton of stuff, but I'm not going to go into everything. I'm going to try and stay on point on the 3 things I mentioned. There were 12 different developmental programs from 12 different countries, as well as the heads of the PSA, the WSF, and US Squash. So it was really was a big jamboree. It was pretty good. So first part, the Olympic discussion, is what we know so far is obviously the LA2028 bid was successful, but it was done in relative secrecy. So nobody really knew what was going on until it was announced that squash was in. And we're not sure why that is, but that's what they do. Why did squash get in? Because it met the parameters of the metrics on what I'm going to talk about in a second. The other thing was the Walter family, who owns the LA Dodgers, were instrumental, I believe, I don't know, but in pushing squash, because they have an ownership and something with the pro squash, and it got in. And what do you need to get into the games? Well, and then there's three pillars of this. There's youth involvement. So the IOC wants young people to participate and take up the sport, and they want a younger viewership, because the average age of people watching the Olympics is 57 years old, and they want that to be much younger. So not only do they want a youthful participation, but they want a young viewership as well. So that's one piece of what the IOC is looking for to get a sport in. The second is community access. So the sport must be accessible to the public, so everybody can play. And we can see that from some of the sports in the games that meet this criteria. Some of the European games we're not familiar with, but they're all public games. Everybody can play. And the third thing is legacy. The sport has to create a lasting effect beyond the sport: camaraderie, sportsmanship, diversity, global participation, and the sport has to give back to the community. And those are the three things that were discussed that are important to get it into the games. And what do you have to do to do this, to get the IOC to recognize and that you measure up to get into the games? And it's obviously the metrics are the growth in the numbers, who plays, where is the legacy, but it's very difficult to do that if this stuff is done in secrecy. So I set up an example with Lindsay's help on this. Is actually, I'll get that in a second. The important point here is there's going to be a vote in 2027 about whether squash makes it into Brisbane 32, but squash has not happened in LA in 28 yet. So how do you know that what you're doing is good enough now to get into the next games? So these are the things that have to be figured out, because the vote is before the LA games in 28. So, it's a mystery, but you have to figure out how you have to improve or cultivate the metrics before you actually get into the games. And an example of that is breakdancing, or breaking, was in Paris, but it's not in LA. So they're one and done. But skateboarding was in Tokyo, was in Paris, and it's in LA. So what did they do to make sure that they got into the games in successive years? Well, we'll get into that in a sec. But the reason why you want to get into 3 successive games is you share the revenue. If you're one and done, or you get another one, you get 2, then you're finished. You don't share in the revenue. And it's not all about money, but it's good for the sport to be in the Olympics games. So getting back to the example, in as I mentioned, breaking was in Paris, but it's not in LA, and it's not obviously in Brisbane. So what did they do versus what skateboarding did? And this is where Lindsay's input was important, because in skateboarding, they have a youthful participation. They're on streaming. They have YouTube. They have podcasts, broadcasts, lots of watchability to a younger crowd, youth participation, free access, a great following, and it's easily viewed when it's on the screen. You can slow-mo it up and everybody can see. The skateboarding CEO was at the summit, and he basically mirrored these comments as well. I'm not going to go into exactly what he said, but it's pretty much on point. So when you look at the two, breaking and skateboarding, and the IOC metrics in mind, why is skateboarding in, and why should squash be aware of this for this vote coming up in 27? So make a long story short, we got into the games in 28, but that doesn't mean you're in Brisbane in 32. So it's a very big deal, and the clock is ticking. So I think that's it for the Olympic Games. I hope that was understood. I tried my best. And the second point was the WSF and the PSA and the US Squash, which is Clevin Clipstein, had a panel, which was fascinating. And I'll run through that. Zena Woodbridge, who's the president of the WSF, was all about a collaboration on growing squash on a global scale. WSF wants to create a legacy around the sport, have a lasting effect on the community, and work with the PSA and other national bodies to bring this home. And on a personal note, I talked to Jamie about this, I think that this is an opportunity for a national body to take leadership on this initiative, because everybody was talking about collaboration there, but I don't know where it's coming from right now. So what I just saw on the screen would be a great example of showing the way forward for other national bodies to grow the sport and have perpetuity in the Olympics. So that's what she was talking about. Alex Goff, who's the CEO of the PSA, went over about the growth of the pro game, and the PSA is 50 years old now, the increase in the prize money, the parity in prize money, and also the nonprofit arm of the PSA, which really helps with the legacy of the sport. So they'll go out and do fundraising or raise money or whatever the nonprofit side does to grow the game. And they're very much have grown immensely and have big plans. And then Kevin Clipstein was also in that, and his comments were that the Olympic inclusion is a validation of the sport. And they really need to increase the awareness of the sport in other people. So it's not just, it's a backwater. It needs to be out there. And a lot of the growth from US squash has come from juniors and high school squash. I'm not sure if everybody follows this, but the high school nationals in the States in February had 1,500 kids. Now, this doesn't include middle school, kids that didn't make the team, JV teams. I mean, I don't know how much bigger that would be. Numbers 1,500, how much bigger that would be if you included everybody, but it's massive. And then, of course, you get to the college end and all that. But how did this happen? How did they get that growth and that participation? Well, certainly it's a college appeal to get into college, which, as Jamie mentioned, 20 years ago, just wasn't there. Now it's front and center. And the utilization of courts. So there's a lot of courts in the US in high schools and colleges and clubs that are not used. So coaches and players come in and use these courts and rent them when otherwise they're not used. Urban programs, all of that has used the court space much better than it was before. And it looks like, I mean, for me, it looks like, because I'm down there, is the US is doing what the IOC is looking for. They got youth involvement, they got youth participation, that they got community involvement with the urban programs. And the legacy part, I'm not sure of, but I'm sure they're taking care of that. One way to measure how much better the US has become on the junior side, on the youth side, is that in the World Juniors, the girls came second and the boys came third. Now, from my perspective, being down there, that's remarkable. I mean, they, as far as I remember, they were never that good, but they're certainly strong now. And they had 4 women ranked in the top 20 on the pro side. So they're really growing. And then the third part was the growth of squash, which was discussed at the summit. In a lot of it's the urban development programs, and it's a real growth point in growing squash. There were 12 countries that got up and spoke about this, and they were US, Brazil, Colombia, India, Japan, Malaysia, the UK, Germany, Ireland, Spain, South Africa, and Guyana. And they all went into what they were doing, and they offer, obviously, squash, they offer academics, they offer meals, they offer support, and they're generating kids that play squash and get better, not only in sport and squash, but in life. So it's really a big thing, and it's global. And in the US, there are several urban programs, like I think we know, which is under the Squash and Education Alliance. And all these kids that go in these programs end up going to college and school. They do road shows to grow the game to other schools that do or do not have courts. And it's a huge piece of the growth part in the US. And there were and then also in these panels, how do you actually grow the sport? And there's five pieces of this. There's the grassroots program or point. There's schools, there's programming in existing facilities, there's new facilities. Now, this was a really fascinating discussion, and it's called the Global Squash Report. I think you can access this online. They have a website, and they talked about squash clubs in, say, in the UK, they're closing, but in other parts they're opening. So Poland is actually the global leader in squash court building and clubs, and one facility has 33 courts, which is the biggest in the world. I thought it was Frans Otten in Amsterdam, which 21, but 33 is much bigger. And this is a really interesting thing about the viability of squash clubs, and they are viable if you have 8 courts or more, was the number that these guys were talking about. But, you know, if you have a minute, I would go and look at it because it's really interesting. It's called Global Squash Report. And then the other thing, the fifth part, is court accessibility. So there was a lot of discussion about outside courts, courts in public facilities, and just getting, you can plop a court anywhere and play. Like they have the pro events and World Open at the Pyramids, and Jamie mentioned the Women's Open at Brookfield. You can do this, you can drop a court anywhere, but getting people to play is another thing. So that was, that's all I have really on three pieces of what we decided to talk about. So I'll leave it back to Jamie or Lindsay, and any questions, I'm ready.
Thank you, Doug.
Pleasure.
Does anyone want to jump in with some questions or thoughts on both of those presentations? While they're just getting their questions lined up, I thought this was cool because, as Doug said, there is no leadership. Like, we really don't know what the metrics are to stay in. It was done in private to get in the first place. It's probably thanks to the US being the host. It's promising that Australia is the next host. But there's some key metrics. So something that we can do, or at least we have control of, is boosting PSA Squash TV viewership. That could be a metric that is used. And Squash Ontario does have a discount program, thanks to the Canadian discount partnership with them. So if anyone's looking to spread that, please let me know. Another thing is making sure, something that we are focused on, is making sure that when the Olympics does happen, people know about squash, or they're aware of squash, and that's with our mini court. So in the next 2 years, we're going to hit the road with our little mini court, which we're really excited about. Thousands of people have already participated and picked up a racket and tried squash, thanks to Tracy getting out there to run these outreach events. But we're going to do that so much more in the next 2 years, and hoping that basically by LA 2028, people will have fond memories of trying squash. I mean, there's so many things we can do and try and be a leader when it comes to all of this. And as like, thanks to Jamie's presentation, it looks like we're already on our way. But we need to continue to be in the Olympics, because it's the sport's success is everyone's success, from everyone on this call.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Lauren.
Doug or Jamie, doesn't matter, whoever feels comfortable answering. I guess there's been a lot of rumors about, individuals versus team, or draw sizes, or how we're gonna know how many spots countries have. Obviously, if it was top in the world, Egypt would probably take up most of the draws. So has there been any advancements on how they might go about that? Like how many spots countries have?
I have a little presentation to share. Maybe now is a good time on what the latest and greatest from the WSF is.
Sure.
Do you want me to do that now?
Yeah.
Okay. It's probably the question I get asked the most, is the format and how many players. So I will share what came. I haven't really digested this. This came to us in a town hall last week from the WSF, World Squash Federation, and I mean, I think everybody off the top needs to brace themselves a little bit. This is one of the reasons we are in the Olympics is because we have a very small footprint. The total number of athletes at the games is a major problem, as well as the infrastructure. And so, you know, we need to use this opportunity, to leverage the sport because it'll be the single most eyeballs we have on it, but also to build the program for 2032. But there's not going to be a lot of squash Olympians, and Canada's likely to have 1 or 2, maybe 3 in a perfect world. So here's what I know. So this is sort of where Doug went over some of this stuff already, but essentially this time last year we were ratified. They're talking about here, the WSF and the PSA were in Paris 2024 as observers. So they went to all the events. You know, I think some of the things I heard them download to us is like, it's really important for us to be clustered in LA with other sports. That gets the max amount of sort of passive traffic. And, you know, people go to the Olympics and they maybe don't get the tickets they want, but we want new people at this squash event. Whenever I go to a big squash tournament, I'm always happy when I don't know the people at the event, because that means the sport's growing. So that's, I think, a big goal. I've heard some of the venues, they're going to LA in February. I'll get to the next slide. But some of the venues I heard recently were MGM Studios. They're going to be putting a lot of events at MGM Studios. So that would be pretty cool. But we want to be with the other sports, and we want as big of a venue as possible. The delegations, they were saying, take up so many of the seats. So just like the players and the, you know, the ambassadors and the politicians, they take up a huge chunk of seats. So there's actually not that many seats available to the general public. So we want as big a venue as possible, you know, somewhere in the 5,000 to 10,000 range. Chris has seen a lot of events here, but, you know, there's a certain pinch point where you can't have 25,000 people watching a squash event. It just doesn't really work, but we want it as big as possible. So they're talking about some of the learnings here from Paris. Not really that, sort of a bit fluffy, but here's what we know on the timeline. So it was confirmed that's a 32 single player draw per gender in April 2024. I actually didn't know that until this past week. There was still some talk of 48 and 64, but it's now 32. The venue will be done by the end of LA20 or 2024. We'll know that. They're doing a visit in November to decide that. The max number of players per NOC and the qualifying program is on everyone's mind. So, you know, these Olympics, you don't see 10 athletes from one country ever. It's likely to be maxed at 2, possibly 3. So you're already hearing a lot of Egyptian players looking for citizenship elsewhere, because there is a cap, and it might only be 2 players. It might be 3, but it's not going to be 4. So that's a good thing for countries like Canada, because Egypt won't be filling up the draw. And then they're really going to use their qualification systems through like the Pan Am Federation. So those are going to, like, Pan Am Games 2027 is in Lima, Santiago, Lima, can't remember. Anyway, that is going to be the qualification event, and Canada will earn 1 female spot, 1 male spot, and 1 wildcard spot, something like that. And then, yeah, so we won't even know that till 2026, but we know that that's sort of when the teams are going to be named, or when the players are going to be named. So that's, yeah, they're saying fair balance between world rankings and qualifying tournaments. They want all players at least 1 opportunity to play, which I think is pretty cool. So, you know, if you're a player in a small country, Guyana, let's say, you've got a shot. You're going to be able to train, and you're going to be able to go and, you know, prove yourself. And then continental games as qualification events, which I touched on. I'll circulate this document. It's a public document. I'm sharing it with all the provinces later today, but I haven't really digested it, so I'm not going to go through it, but there's some good stuff here. Questions?
Thanks again, Jamie. My final, if no one has any questions, just my final sort of point here is, we like to compare ourselves to the US a lot, which is unfortunate, but sometimes just needs to be done. The funding piece is so interesting for us because funding in Canada looks a lot different than any other country. And it's exciting because both Squash Canada and Squash Ontario are have new opportunities for funding to flow into high performance programming. But it's not much compared to a lot of the other countries. So back to Jamie's presentation, like to support these athletes is we're all going to need to come together, and that's where the fundraising donation helps so much. Hosting events at your club, supporting future Olympic athletes. Again, we have people in Ontario that could be those athletes. So it's a very exciting time, and it's somewhat easy to get involved right now.
Yep. My final note would be I would need to see every single one of you and all of your members at Brookfield Place in Toronto at the end of October. That is where we show the world what we're made of. And we just need to get out and support that event and support the athletes and, start ramping this thing up to 2028. That's where it all begins. So hope to see you all there. If I don't, I know where to find you.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time today. Thank you, Doug and Jamie, for touching on that. Obviously, the more information we get, we'll flow it back out. Jamie, I'll share those presentations with everyone too.